everyone. We are here today at the Salt Lake Community College campus with Connie Spanton-Jex. She is the head of the interpreting program here for ASL. If you have a kiddo that is using ASL, or you're wondering about if ASL is a language that you want to explore more, Connie has some really great information for us about interpreters and when you're out in public or maybe in the school setting. We did have a couple of questions beforehand that we might kind of start off, but first, Connie, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit and telling people maybe your story?
Sure. So I didn't learn sign language until I went to college, and I had been working I had actually been at college, and I came home for the semester break, one of the breaks, and was working at Harmon's grocery store in Taylorsville. And there was a deaf couple I could see signing, and the deaf gentleman come up to me, and he wanted to be able to purchase something, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so after a few attempts of trying to figure out what he wanted and understand his speech, he pointed and told me, get him a piece of paper and a pen, and I gave him, and he wrote down what he wanted. And that was what sparked my interest in learning how to sign. And so once I had graduated from College of Eastern Utah, I went up to Utah State University and took some ASL classes there. And that kind of started my journey, and I've just been, associating and being part of the deaf community ever since. I have a deaf child who's 28 that I adopted, and I've worked here at the community college for like 17 years, and I am a nationally certified interpreter.
Cool.
So that's kind of real brief. That's not what you really want to hear. You want to learn the other stuff, so I don't want to bore you with that.
Yeah, but that's great because that helps everybody know kind of what your credentials are and why are you a good candidate to be sharing this information with us today. And we really appreciate your time, so thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Questions? Heather.
I'm here.
Here's Heather.
So I will be watching for questions to come through and just fielding those. So if you have any questions that come up, send those through and I'll pass it on.
Yes, please feel free to send those through. Whether you catch this live or not, even if you miss it, if you don't be able to watch this live, please still feel free to send your comments in, and we will do our best to make sure that those get answered. Okay. So first of all, we had a great question come through about if you are going to an appointment and you request an interpreter, is there any way to request a specific interpreter?
So, you can always request for a specific interpreter. The problem is that most interpreters make their living, especially in the freelance type of community, part-time, right? Or they work for an agency, and that agency is, taking care of the needs of the entire community. And so you can request, and if they can, I think that more than likely the agency or the interpreter will be willing to show up and do it. It would probably just depend on their schedule and what they already have scheduled prior to your request. But I would definitely, if there's a specific interpreter that you really, really like, definitely put in the request because, as I teach my kids, the answer is always no if you don't ask, and you have a 50-50 chance of getting what you want if you do ask. So
that's true. Good point. Good point. And then we had another question about interpreter qualifications, and there was some confusion about, especially in an educational setting, sometimes in the public setting when we're going to an event, it's not really necessary to, request a specific interpreter, but and some people don't want to take the time to know what all the certifications are for a public event for an interpreter coming. But if you're using an interpreter continuously on a regular basis, what kind of qualifications do people want to know about?
So, well, in the state of Utah, there are 4 types of certifications that your interpreter could have. There is the EIPA certification, which is specifically only for K through 12. And in Utah, that's the only place those interpreters can interpret is in the classroom. They're not even supposed to be interpreting for your IEP meetings or anything like that. They're only certified to interpret in the classroom if that's the only certification that they have. And those interpreters also get those certifications K through 6 and 6 through 12. So the EIPA is separated that way. So you need that. And then you have, the Utah State has what they call a novice certification, which is a temporary certification that interpreters get. Usually that's what our students get once they graduate from our interpreting program. And that certification is good for 4 years. And then at that point, they need to be able to bump up. Sometime in that 4 years, they have to be able to bump up to professional, and that's a sustainable certification. And so obviously we can make the assumption that our novice interpreters are not going to be as skilled or as experienced as our professional interpreters. And then you have the national RID certification, which is called the NIC. And that one, the individuals have to have a bachelor's degree to have earned that one, unless they got that degree, or they got that certification years ago. Like myself, I got it. I mean, I have a degree, but for some interpreters, they may not have it if they've been nationally certified for a long time. And so a national certification allows interpreters to work all over the United States, where Utah certification is only going to be good here in Utah and maybe some of the surrounding states. So I think it's good for you to always know what type of certification your child has, and then deciding, depend on the event and what you're doing, what are the stakes, how good of an interpreter do you need. Obviously, a novice interpreter will probably be less expensive for an entity than a professional interpreter. So there are those different types of certification, and a novice interpreter can interpret in the school system just as an EIPA interpreter can, but an EIPA interpreter is not, according to Utah state law. Every state is different. So what I have to say today is only about Utah. They are not allowed to interpret outside of the classroom.
Okay, so as an interpreter for your classroom could have either a novice certificate or an EIPA certificate or
a professional. And then even I have students that have graduated from the program that I know that interpret in the K-12 setting, who have national certification, who have professional certification, who have novice, and who have So I have students that are out working who have all of those certifications.
Okay, but the novice one is only good for 4 years, and then can they renew that one again?
No, they have to move up to professional.
Okay, or they lose the novice.
Or they lose it, right?
Okay.
It's meant to be a temporary certification, kind of a working permit, so that they can acquire the skills that we feel are appropriate to maintain that certification.
Okay. So could we kind of consider a novice certificate kind of like an apprenticeship?
Yes.
Giving them like a temporary spot, but eventually they have to move on.
And the novice allows them to get paid. So
Okay.
interpreters in the state of Utah, until they have some sort of certification, are not allowed to get paid. In fact, interpreters in the state of Utah, whether you get paid or not, you're not allowed to interpret without certification, basically, unless it's in a religious setting. That's the state law.
Okay. Okay, so that's good to know. So if you're in a religious setting, you're allowed to have an interpreter come who does not have
certification.
a certification.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if you're in the community, what kind of an event would somebody want to request an interpreter for, and kind of how would that work out? Who's required to provide one?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but I will say that almost any open public event, that's accessible by any of us that can hear should be required to provide some sort of interpreting. Now, a lot of places will try to, like nonprofits or, again, I'm not an expert, but they'll try to say, but the key thing is if they receive some sort of government funding at all. So any of your community ed classes, if your child wants to be involved in a community education class or learn to play a sport, they are all required by law to provide interpreters. Now they'll all try, my experience is that they'll all try really hard to send somebody else. Like I remember when I have a son who's deaf, that's 28. I remember when he was younger and we were participating in junior jazz and I requested an interpreter. They tried to send me somebody who was in a high school ASL class. And then I was like, oh no. And as a mom who was a certified interpreter, I did do some interpreting for him instead. I was, running up and down the basketball court. I remember pregnant trying to interpret for him. But they are required to provide that. Now, if it's, over 2 hours, sometimes you can maybe say, well, you don't have to get a second one, but maybe you could advocate for my students. How about you get one certified interpreter and then contact the community college and get a student to go along with the certified interpreter, right? To kind of learn and get experience.
Okay, so that's a way to kind of help.
To help them ease their cost, a little bit.
So that's a good way to just kind of negotiate. Like, I can help you with some other resources that might not cost you as much, but it's still important that somebody else is there to help.
Right. I mean, these, public places that, like you said, we talked about this on the phone, that receive funding, they have to, by law, provide your child with an interpreter. And it doesn't matter if your child can lip read or if your child can speak, or they don't get to decide what the accommodation should be. You and your child gets to decide what that accommodation needs to be. And there's so many things we were talking about. There's so many things going on around those conversations, like on a basketball team, right? Yeah, so your kid can maybe talk one-on-one, but what about all of the conversations the kids are having around in the team that helps your kid, participate and enjoy? You want them to hear and understand those conversations too, because those are really important to your child's development.
Right, and have an opportunity to participate.
Right, and say, hey, yeah. Yeah. Even if the interpreter is just providing what they can't hear because people are talking all over the place, and then they can talk for themselves, right? It helps include them and help them feel included.
Okay, so you mentioned kids maybe that might have technology or that use hearing aids or cochlear implants are still candidates to use and benefit from an interpreter if they understand American Sign Language.
Correct. That was one of my biggest takeaways that I attended the American Society of Deaf Children conference this last summer, is that we want to provide our deaf children with every possible tool that we can, right? And so an interpreter is just one more tool for them so that they can catch, all that incidental learning that we just don't ever stop to think about, that you hear driving to work, listening to your radio, or just conversations in the hall at work, or, all those things your child is missing out on. And they could be provided with that information if they had an interpreter.
Great. Yeah, that's great information. I think sometimes those kiddos get left out, or you get more pushback if you have a child who is using the aid of technology to kind of help them hear. That if your child qualifies for that, you still are required to have an interpreter available. And there's lots of resources. We'll be sharing some more resources on where you can find more legal information and things like that for situations. But what are maybe some pros and cons you found or tips maybe in getting and accessing the interpreter? You gave the example of playing basketball, but maybe in other settings, did you find what worked good for you?
So I always advocating, and if you don't know a lot of ASL or you're just kind of learning, I still think that as a parent you should go out and watch your student if they have an interpreter and see how they're interacting with that interpreter. And if you need to, find somebody who does know something about interpreters, take them along with you to watch and gauge whether the interpreter is doing a good job or not. I probably was, I'm sure interpreters didn't like it, but I would show up and watch my son's interpreters, and sometimes I asked for a change of interpreter. Okay. That's something you definitely can do, and I think that could be based on a number of reasons. It may not just be, the signing skill. It could be other. Maybe you don't feel like they're really working for your child or so forth. Sometimes, I don't know if this is a little off topic, but one of the things I think that you want to be careful with is that your interpreter, especially as your child gets older and into middle school, high school, maybe those upper grades, that the interpreter's not doing too much for them. Okay. Because down the road you want your child to be able to do those things independently, without you. If you get, I've heard stories of interpreters that take notes, or interpreters that help out on tasks or help out with homework, and that's not necessarily. I think in the beginning, that's we do some of that, but as they get older, we try to wean them away from that and make them independent, because that's ultimately your goal, is that your child can function independently, just like anybody else, and they should, and they can.
Right. So you can be watching for signs, and I think that's a good thing to point out, that you can request a change of interpreter at any time, and that your interpreter definitely shouldn't be working as a tutor or a liaison or a teacher's aide, right? Or like you said, we've had experiences with that where we've had.
Well, you get, and that's probably, and I'm sure some of that comes up with school districts. I mean, of course, school districts are trying to save. Everybody's trying to save money where they can, right? And so, but I think when your students are younger, that might be easier for interpreters to do some of that. But at some point, as the kids get older, just like you would with your own kids that can hear, you start expecting them to be more independent and to do things and to take care of things on their own. One of the big things is that I teach my students here as interpreters, like a lot of times the teacher will approach the interpreter and say, and ask them questions about the student. The interpreter's answer should always be, hey, great, let me go and let's go in and I'll interpret that question for you, instead of responding to the teacher, right? They should always offer to go and interpret so that your student is making that connection. The teacher is the authority figure in this classroom. That's who I need to talk to. It's not me to the interpreter, and then the interpreter talks,
Okay. So they shouldn't be the middleman.
Yeah, they shouldn't be the middleman.
But they should be helping the child advocate for direct communication. And
Right. So if the kid does ask, then just redirecting, just like the teacher would. Oh, that's a great question. You missed that. Let's go ask the teacher for clarification, just to make sure that I understood it as the interpreter, and I'll be happy to interpret that again for you.
okay, so what are some red flags that you might want to request an interpreter, maybe in a public setting? What about families who don't know ASL well enough to say, I think that interpreter might not be being very accurate? How could they have kind of that quality control, make sure that their kid's getting accurate information?
So I just want to make sure I understand. So you're saying in a public setting, so not in the classroom?
Yeah, so outside of the classroom, we kind of talked about some things, some red flags.
Well, I guess you can,
well,
one of the things, obviously if you don't know, it's kind of hard to gauge. Like, I can't tell if somebody speaks Spanish really well or not because I don't know the language. But as far as credentialing, you can always definitely ask if they can, show you their certification. And also, even more, you can take that interpreter's name. The state of Utah has a website where every interpreter who's credentialed and has the right to work in the state is listed. You can always look up your child's interpreter by name and see what type of certification that they have.
Okay.
So you at least know that they have that, right? If you can't find that and they can't produce it, then there's a cause for concern right there. Okay. One, that they're interpreting illegally.
Right.
The state of Utah requires that we register with them, and so they know that we're there.
Okay, so say you're going to a public event, when we're in a school setting, we know who our interpreter is, but in a public event, we don't always know who the interpreter is going to be. Do they have to give notice of who the interpreter will be beforehand so
Probably
that you can
not.
check? Okay.
Probably not. So I see requests for let's say your family likes to go to Desert Star Theater, right? Or any of the theaters around, and you want to take your deaf child to experience that. You definitely can request an interpreter. I think it gets really hard. It's hard to request. If you know somebody, I guess you could say, hey, I have a friend, they would be willing to come interpret. You can contact them and give them information. Or you can just make that request. And a lot of times there'll be that kick. I think the famous answer is always, well, do you have somebody in the family that can do that? Do you have a friend you can bring along?
Yes.
Or can you do that? For certain things, I think that's okay. Some things it's not, because you want to be there to be the advocate for your child if you do know sign language. But like a play, you want to go enjoy it with your kids, so you don't want to have to be the one interpreting it as well. So a play is going to, you do have an opportunity to have a script. It's really hard to say, well, what skill level do you need for that? I would say when it comes to medical, you want to make sure that you get, a skilled interpreter. If it's just the flu shot, if it's just the annual checkup, but if your child has something, a serious medical condition, and you want to make sure that they understand as well, you want to get a good interpreter for that. So I think you can say, I want a professional interpreter or nationally certified. I don't want a novice, but we talk about different, you could have a novice interpreter who would be great for a certain situation because maybe they have experience in that topic. So it gets to be, I think the basic thing, the more information you can give whoever's going to hire the interpreter about the job, the better they can maybe match what you need.
Okay.
Does that make
sense? So if you can, when you're requesting an interpreter, you can say, these are kind of some of my concerns, or this is what my child is like. Do you have an interpreter that might fit better with my child?
Telling them, oh, well, my child can speak for themselves. I just need the interpreter to interpret the information to them. Or my child can't speak. My child doesn't speak. We'll need the interpreter to voice for them. Those are important things for an agency or the interpreters to know before they show up too. Am I going to have to voice and sign to this deaf child, or am I going to just sign to this deaf child?
Okay, great. So at what age should you start asking for an interpreter? when you're taking your child to like the doctor or the dentist? When should that?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Wow, that's a really good question. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. I guess some of it depends on your child's attention span. I mean, if I have an 18-month-old deaf child, I mean, I'm not gonna, I can barely get my granddaughter to look at me, let alone to get them to look at an interpreter. So maybe I would say, I mean, interpreters probably aren't provided in the school system until a child's 5, probably. I don't know. Do you use them in preschool? Do they use them in preschool at all? In any of the settings?
I don't believe they do unless you are attending a preschool with a district.
With a district.
Yeah,
But for example, my daughter, I have been nervous about asking for an interpreter because I don't know if she'll pay attention.
Right.
So how would that affect having an interpreter?
The interesting thing is that an interpreter is provided to provide equal access. And so, but your child has equal access to ignoring the interpreter, just like any, we send our kids to school. No, we know lots of them don't pay attention when they're in school, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we have this conversation with our interpreter for our little girl all the time.
But an interpreter can't be like, well, they're not paying attention to me, so you don't need me.
Yeah, right.
It's not really, that's
right. And I feel like preschool is required because it's a public entity. They receive federal funds. If you have a preschooler who's not at a school where a teacher of the deaf is teaching that knows sign language, that your child is, I feel like that's an appropriate request. And even though it's a young age, you want to start training kids to pay attention and using an interpreter, right? Even if it's in short bursts of time, just like we train them to have bigger attention spans with any other activity in school. That's something that's like you have to teach them how to use an interpreter. And probably the sooner you start, the sooner they'll pick up and use.
Definitely. Because I think children have to learn how to use an interpreter too. They don't know how. They just like, oh, here's an interpreter. Well, they don't know how to use that interpreter. But what age? That's a little bit difficult. My son was at a school for the deaf, and so we didn't really necessarily need interpreters at that young age. But when he was fairly young, he had a medical situation, and when we would go, but we lived in Washington D.C., so they provide interpreters for everything. It wasn't even questioned. I would just sign up, and I would show up, and there would be an interpreter. That was just, that was junior jazz stuff. Everything was just interpreters were provided. So yeah, when he played soccer there, when he did things there, they just had interpreters, and he was young. I guess he's adopted, and we adopted him at 5. So and we moved from there when he was about 8. So, but he had interpreters in that time.
Okay.
So I think the thing that you have to think about is reasonable, right? It's not reasonable to expect the preschool to have an interpreter there for 8 hours all day long, I don't think.
Right.
But are there certain times when there's instruction? But then that gets hard because what interpreter wants to show up for 15 minutes, right?
Right.
And then leave and then come back. So, that's, I guess, some of the things, the pros of, being where in a group, I think what they call those, not a cohort, they don't call them a cohort, but as a group, cluster group, something.
Right, like a community where you have like
a smaller
like-minded language.
I mean, again, like I said, the biggest thing that we're talking is just all that communication that's going on, all that little chit chat that the kids are missing. So.
And the bottom line is access to language, right? So whether or not the child is taking it in or not, and a lot just like spoken language, ASL is a visual language, and you still have to learn the receptive skills for that. And there's residual language learning. So even if your child's not directly looking, or it seems like they're not paying attention, they are catching on to something because it's residual.
Well, and they see things we may not realize, but they probably see things out of the corner of their eyes, even though it may appear that they're not paying attention.
Right. Yeah, it's true. So my interpretation would be that if you're in a public setting, having it around and getting them used to seeing someone, if that's your chosen mode of language, I think is a great idea, just to have it accessible for them, whether they're paying attention or not. And maybe if you're just learning too, it's a great way for you to have some more access to the language if you're available.
Right.
And seeing it.
Definitely. It's, just like you said, finding an interpreter who's available to come to do that. I mean, there's so many factors
Right.
to go with everything.
Right. You shared a really great experience about just here at work, and the difference between your opportunity to hear background conversations and kind of what's the way that the interpreter kind of helps bridge that gap for somebody who might not be able to hear all of the background. Would you mind sharing that?
So, I was just sharing that, like, here at work, I'm able to freely walk about, and I can hear conversations happening, and I can just join in those conversations, where my deaf coworkers, they're not able to overhear and become interested and walk over. They're able to oversee, so that's why I encourage my students, we teach them sign, to always be signing so they can come in and participate. But I'm then able to take that information and then I share it with my coworkers.
Do you mind helping us, Heather, with that? That was our sign.
Anyway, I'm able to, go off and I'm able to share that information, which is really, I think sometimes we think that information is not valuable, but,
is that okay?
we got my computer too.
Oh, you're
Okay.
But we're about out of time.
Are you okay?
There we
We're
go.
about out
I
of
think,
time. Mary's will last
for
us.
some reason, we're
Okay.
not getting any charge anymore.
Oh.
I don't know why. Anyway, all these weird things going on here.
Technical difficulties. It happens.
That is weird. Anyway, so I think the big thing is that we take for granted how much we learn every day just overhearing, driving to work, listening to KSL, what's going on in the world, just hearing little conversations and picking what you want. You learn a lot. And that's kind of the things that I think deaf children, regardless of the method that you choose for your child, whether it's just complete, spoken or signing, is that they still are missing out on that information. And as much as that we can give to them, the better, I think, for them. So it's been a fun journey. It's been an interesting journey, but it's interesting. So in some ways, I feel like my deaf child is more independent. He had a brother that I adopted at the same time who can hear, and he maintains a job. He works hard. He's a good employee. People love him. He's always done really well, where my hearing child has struggled to keep a job. You know what I mean? And so he functions just fine. And I think that's really cool, is that we don't have to, you don't have to be like, oh, I'm gonna have to take care of my deaf kid the rest of his life. No, definitely not, right?
So does he
capable.
have an interpreter at work where he is, or is he?
He doesn't. But interesting story. So yesterday he was telling me that he does like he's like a fix-it man. He likes that. He likes to fix things. But they had a meeting, and today with technology, I said, oh, well, how did you understand? You must have missed the entire meeting, because what did you do? He says, oh, no, one of my other coworkers pulled out their phone, and when he was talking, then it just, kind of like the whole Siri thing or whatever, it just
captioned it.
It kind of captioned it for him. And I'm sure it wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But at least he got more out of that than he would have if he hadn't had that opportunity, right?
Okay.
So
will you share also the experience you shared about your husband and his skills and kind of the pros and cons with how he chose to communicate?
I was explaining that he was just a natural lip reader. In fact, when they figured out that he was deaf, almost 3 years old, and they took him into the doctors, and they were like, how could we not know that this kid was deaf? The doctor said, well, watch, or the audiologist said, well, watch this, and put his hand overhead, and he actually pulled the hand down, and so they figured that he was just naturally lip reading. However, and so he kind of functioned that way through life. He didn't sign. He just did the oral method, or listening to spoken language now we call it. And but later in life, when he was working at a job, and he was a good employee, very bright, does everything, but he didn't ask for interpreters. He didn't advocate for himself. He ended up getting fired from the job, and learned a very valuable lesson, that he was missing out on just little tiny things because he wasn't asking for an interpreter. He was trying to lip read and do everything on his own, and so he missed things. He ended up getting fired, and now he advocates for an interpreter. He has an interpreter with him all the time. And so I think that was a really valuable lesson to him, that he learned that even though he can speak and he can lip read and one-on-one, he's great. Oh no, I'm afraid we just died.
Did it die?
Yeah, I don't know. Did we die?